This is the Bois de Boulogne, one of Paris's largest and most popular parks. It is a sprawling playground for the people of the French capital, a place of trails, lakes, restaurants, picnic grounds, camping sites, and after dark, a notorious hotspot for prostitution. In short, this is a place usually associated with joy above all else. But on a warm summer evening in June of 1981, as numerous Parisians filled the park to soak up the last couple of rays of sunlight, that joyful mood took a sharp and chilling turn. Near the edge of one of the park's lakes, a large, suspicious-looking suitcase was found, laying in the grass, and when a curious bystander opened it, they made a stomach-churning discovery. A blood-soaked bedsheet wrapped tightly around a set of human body parts. Inside not just one, but two of these suitcases were the remains of Renée Harteveld, a promising young literature student from the Netherlands. Just a couple of days prior, she had been shot and killed inside a nearby apartment by a fellow student, a Japanese man named Sagawa Issei. And soon, as more horrifying details about the crime started to emerge, Sagawa became one of the most reviled figures in all of France. Because, as it turned out, what had happened to Renée Harteveld wasn't just murder. It was a cannibal murder, the chilling realization of a cannibalistic fantasy that Sagawa, born and raised in Japan, had harbored since his childhood. Now, taking the life of an innocent young woman and then consuming parts of her body is about as grotesque a crime as one can possibly imagine. And actually, Sagawa was arrested shortly after his victim's remains were discovered. But while it should have been the end of his story, Sagawa's arrest in June of 1981 turned out to be just the beginning. When in a mind-boggling series of events, he managed to escape serious punishment before returning to his home country of Japan, where somehow he went on to transform his gruesome crime into fame and money. So, how does a man commit such an unthinkable act in a foreign country and then just walk away from it all, almost completely unscathed? And even more disturbingly, how did he become a minor celebrity by being a cannibal murderer? Well, buckle up, because today's story is a wild one. It is the story of Sagawa Issei, the Japanese cannibal who walked free. So, how about we get started with the most obvious question in the room here. What was it that drove Sagawa Issei to not only commit a murder, but also to engage in cannibalism back in 1981? Well, as we will see, Sagawa's haunting crime was the result of two deeply rooted obsessions that had followed him since his early childhood. Obsession number one. The obvious and disturbing one, the desire to consume human flesh. Interestingly, Sagawa was able to recall the exact moment this grotesque desire first took root. It was in the first grade of elementary school, he would have been 6 years old at the time, when he caught a glimpse of a boy's thigh. For some reason, it was an image that ingrained itself into the young Sagawa Issei's mind, sparking a strange fascination which then gradually evolved into what he recalls as his earliest cannibalistic fantasies. Now, Sagawa himself explained that at first, these urges were actually not centered around literal consumption. Rather, as he described it, it was more about the act of biting into someone's body. Or to be more precise, and as he grew older, it was a woman's body that he wanted to sink his teeth into. And actually, he had a very specific type of woman in mind as well. Which brings us to obsession number two, his fixation on white women, which began during his teenage years. While in junior high school, Sagawa developed a bit of a crush on American actress Grace Kelly. Or, well, Honestly, it was less of a crush and more of a straight-up obsession with her. An obsession so strong that from that point on, Sagawa was sure that he had found his type. Tall, healthy-looking, white women. The complete opposite of what he saw in the mirror every day. And not just in terms of gender or ethnicity. Sagawa Issei was born in Kobe, Japan in 1949 into a wealthy and prominent family. His father, Sagawa Akira, was the president of Kurita Water Industries. His grandfather, an editor at the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's biggest and most respected newspapers. Quite the family to be born into. But unfortunately, there were some complications during his actual birth. Sagawa Issei was born prematurely, something he later attributed to his mother falling down a set of stairs during pregnancy. And as a result, he was so small at birth, his father would claim that the newborn could fit in the palm of his hand. In fact, he was so frail and underdeveloped that his parents feared that their newborn son wouldn't survive for long. But thanks to frequent checkups by a doctor and the right treatment, the little Issei would develop into a fairly healthy young kid. However, one thing never changed. Throughout his entire life, he would remain small and frail. As a fully grown adult, he stood at just 151 centimeters, or around 5 feet tall, and weighed less than 50 kilograms, or 110 pounds. And perhaps this is exactly where a twisted sort of logic developed in his mind. What if his future girlfriend, sexual partner, perhaps even wife, was the complete opposite of him? Tall, healthy, good-looking. Maybe that would make him feel like these attributes were also a part of him. You know, in a way, at least. Sagawa himself eventually stated in an interview that it was this exact set of traits that was so different from what he himself had to offer that kept his obsession with tall, foreign women alive into his early adulthood and beyond, as he left his parents' house in Kobe behind to attend Wako University in Tokyo. Sagawa was now 24 years old, and his sexual desire to nibble at a woman's flesh had now developed into something far more sinister. A full-on urge to consume their flesh. An urge that was already so strong that it soon pushed him towards committing a crime for the first time in his life. One day, while out and about near his home in Tokyo, Sagawa crossed paths with a woman who seemed to embody all of his sexual obsessions. A tall, blonde German woman with beautiful thighs. She was everything he had ever desired, and she was right here in Tokyo. But even better yet, he knew exactly where she lived. A nearby apartment that his grandmother used to live in. And so, Sagawa simply couldn't hold back any longer. And that very same night, he broke into her apartment, fully intent on acting out his fantasy. He entered while she was asleep, armed with a vague plan. To knock her unconscious with an umbrella, then fetch a knife from the kitchen and remove a piece of flesh from her buttocks for him to taste. Thankfully, his plan failed almost immediately. As he moved closer, his knees accidentally brushed against her body, waking her up. Obviously, she was way taller and stronger than him, and so in the ensuing struggle, she managed to restrain him long enough to call for help. The police arrived soon thereafter, and Sagawa was arrested on charges of attempted sexual assault. They were, however, completely unaware that Sagawa's true intentions had been even more horrifying than what he was actually charged with. Sagawa himself obviously didn't tell anyone about what he was actually trying to do that night, and he never saw the inside of a jail cell either. His wealthy father quickly intervened, paying a settlement to make the incident disappear. His son then went on to quietly resume his life, as if nothing ever happened, transferring to Kansei Gakuin University in Nishinomiya and completing a master's degree in literature in 1976. His next plan, pursue a PhD abroad. And to do so, he chose a place as far away from Japan as possible, both culturally and geographically. Sagawa left for Paris on April 26, 1977, his 28th birthday. It was his first time abroad, and the French capital seemed to offer everything he had been fascinated with. Art, culture, and of course the very type of women he had been obsessed with since his teenage years. But as he arrived in the city of love, his cannibalistic urges were growing stronger and stronger, and his grip on them was slowly beginning to fray. But above all else, Sagawa had of course come to Paris to pursue a PhD in literature, and in order to do so, he enrolled at the Sorbonne, one of the city's most prestigious universities. And in order to make the most of his stay in Paris and his studies, he would also need a place to stay that matched his lofty ambitions. And so he rented an apartment at 10 Rue Erlanger, located in the upscale 16th arrondissement and near the legendary Bois de Boulogne Park. It was a neighborhood that was far out of reach for most students, but easily afforded by Sagawa thanks to his family's incredible wealth. And so, surrounded by art, literature, and luxury, Sagawa also began spending vast sums of money on something else entirely: physical pleasures. Upon his arrival in Paris, he started hiring sex workers pretty much every single evening, a routine that he later claimed was fueled not just by his intense sexual desires, but also by an internal struggle to keep his violent fantasies at bay. He even admitted that during this period, he already came pretty damn close to committing his very first murder numerous times. Quote, "Almost every night, I would bring a prostitute home and then try to shoot them from behind. I tried hundreds of times, but for some reason my fingers froze up and I couldn't pull the trigger. Rather than morals and whatnot, it was instinct that stopped my hand from moving. Somewhere in my mind, I knew that I, and the world that I lived in, would shatter to pieces the moment I pulled that trigger." End quote. It seems that initially, these thoughts were enough to stop him from actually committing a murder, but not for much longer, unfortunately. It was during a literature seminar at the Sorbonne that Sagawa Issei had his first encounter with a 25-year-old Dutch student named Renée Hartevelt. He had seen many beautiful women during his first couple of years in Paris, but all of them were, as Sagawa himself put it, completely stuck up and out of his league. But Renée, she was different, as warm and friendly as she was tall and beautiful. At 178 centimeters or 5'10", she towered over Sagawa. But regardless of their differences in appearance and cultural background, the two eventually ended up developing a sort of friendship driven by their mutual studies and interests. A friendship that would, however, soon turn out to be fatal for the young Dutch student. By June 1st, 1981, Renée had come to trust Sagawa enough to agree to visit his apartment alone for the first time. She was interested in Japanese cuisine, and he invited her over to have a little sukiyaki party together. But as innocent as that idea might have seemed, Sagawa was already deeply immersed in his grotesque fantasies. At one point during the evening, Renée went to wash her hands, and it was then that Sagawa's murderous instincts kicked into gear once again. Watching her wash her hands in his bathroom reminded him of the prostitutes that he had previously hosted at his apartment, who would clean themselves in that very same bathroom after providing their services to him. In Sagawa's mind, the image of the prostitutes he had attempted but failed to shoot so many times in the past started to overlap with that of Renée more and more. And from that moment on, every time Renée visited, Sagawa prepared himself to strike. He would take out his .22 caliber rifle, wait for her to turn her back, and then just freeze. His fantasy would simply collapse under the weight of reality over and over again. Until one day, it didn't. 10 days after their sukiyaki party, the 25-year-old visited the apartment once again. In a letter that he sent to Renée, Sagawa made up a story about his professor who wanted a German poem recorded, and asked Renée, who was fluent in German, for help with his assignment. Kind as she was, she agreed to help, and as she sat down at his desk, she started to read the poem that Sagawa had personally chosen aloud. Sagawa, in the meantime, retrieved his .22 caliber rifle once again, then stepped behind her, took a deep breath, the bullet struck the back of her neck. Renée died instantly. Sagawa, after finally going through with the murder that he had fantasized about for so long, had fainted from the shock of actually seeing the dead body of his fellow student laying right there in front of him, motionless. And when he came to shortly after, he actually considered calling for help for a brief moment. Quote, "For a split second, I thought about calling an ambulance. But then I thought, hang on, don't be stupid. You've been dreaming about this for 32 years, and now it's actually happening." End quote. The initial shock was then quickly replaced by arousal and obsession. Sagawa laid Renée's body on a towel, undressed her, and began fulfilling the fantasies he had rehearsed in his head for decades. He first tried to bite into her flesh, but found his teeth weren't enough. A fruit knife failed too. So he left the apartment, bought a curved butcher knife, and returned. With that, he began consuming her flesh, some of it raw, some cooked, taking photographs during various stages of consumption. He also stored various pieces in the fridge for later, selecting what he later disturbingly called his favorite parts. This went on for around 2 days. But then Sagawa encountered a problem that he had never even considered: what to do with the rest of the body. As the remains began to decompose in his apartment, reality crept back in, and as panic replaced fantasy, he began chopping up the rest of the body into smaller parts, stuffed them into 2 large suitcases, and hailed a taxicab to the nearby Bois de Boulogne park, hoping to dispose of them in a lake as soon as possible and unnoticed. Things did not go as planned. You see, the evening of June 13th was a hot Saturday evening, and the park was still teeming with people at around 8 p.m. when Sagawa headed there. Sunbathers, families, couples, hardly the discreet setting he had in mind. And so he wandered for a while, dragging the heavy suitcases with him, until finally he found a secluded slope near the lake's edge. He shoved the suitcases down the slope and towards the lake, then lingered for a moment, watching the sun set over Paris, a short breather that should have been his undoing. A passerby spotted one of the suitcases that Sagawa had turned his back to, and finding that whole scene to be a bit suspicious, he opened it, and immediately saw the blood-stained bedsheet wrapped around the remains of Renée. "Murderer," the man shouted towards a woman up the hill, as Sagawa, unsure how to react getting caught in the act, simply walked away and fled the scene. Starting the following day, the police issued a public call for witnesses who were able to describe the man who tried to dump a body at Bois de Boulogne Park. There wasn't exactly a shortage of people who saw a tiny Asian man drag 2 heavy suitcases through the park that evening. And soon, law enforcement had a pretty good idea of who they were looking for. And then, a man came forward who was able to lead the police directly to the culprit's doorstep. The taxi driver who took Sagawa to the park that evening. The driver remembered Sagawa very well. After all, he was the one who loaded and unloaded the 2 suitcases from the trunk of the cab. He also remembered Sagawa's appearance, and most importantly, his exact address: 10 Rue Erlanger. And so, just 4 days after the crime, and before the remains had even been identified as Renée Harteveld, the police arrived at the Sagawa apartment. There, they found their culprit, who was eerily cooperative, along with a scene that sent shivers down their spines. The missing body parts of Renée, kept in labeled plastic bags and on paper plates inside his refrigerator. This was more than enough evidence to warrant Sagawa's immediate arrest, and soon the French media caught wind of what had happened, turning the story of the Japanese cannibal in Paris into one of the biggest news stories of the year, and Sagawa into the most loathed criminal in the country. What happened to Renée Hartevelt shook an entire country to its core. But believe it or not, the strangest chapter of Sagawa's life story was yet to come. So, the elephant in the room right now is obviously, how the hell did Sagawa Issei get away unscathed? I mean, just to get a comparison, take a look at what happened to two other infamous cannibal murderers. Armin Mewes, the Rothenburg cannibal, life in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer, life in prison times 15. There are plenty more examples like these, but you get the point. Committing a cannibalistic murder is usually and quite obviously a one-way ticket to prison for the rest of your life. And yet, Sagawa Issei, as far as I can tell, is the only proven cannibalistic murderer, at least in modern history, to never be charged for what he did. And the reasons as to why that is the case are as fascinating as they are infuriating. Following his arrest at the apartment, Sagawa was taken into custody and questioned by the police. And not only did he confess, apparently he enthusiastically shared every horrific detail of the crime with seemingly zero remorse. If anything, it seemed like he was somewhat proud of what he had done. Then, after confessing, Sagawa was kept inside a maximum security prison in Paris. A trial should have been the next logical step, right? Well, before his case could even go to trial, he was set to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, the goal being to determine whether Sagawa Issei was legally insane or not. That evaluation took an incredible 14 months to complete, with 3 independent psychiatric experts reviewing everything. His childhood, his emotional detachment, his reaction to getting caught, the way he carried out the murder and attempted to dispose of the body, and perhaps most importantly, his complete lack of empathy for the victim. The final conclusion: Sagawa Issei was declared legally insane, and therefore unfit to stand trial. His case never even made it to court. Sagawa's lawyer, Philippe Lemaire, had this to say.
Unquestionably, it would have been unacceptable to try this man. In France, we don't try mentally ill persons. This is the difference between democratic countries and dictatorships.
Renée Harteveld's family demanded a second medical opinion. The request was denied. Now, even though he wasn't tried, which is frankly unbelievable, Sagawa, he wasn't quite a free man just yet. Instead of staying in prison, he was sent to a Parisian mental hospital, indefinitely. That was until his lawyer started pulling some strings. He reached out to the French Department of the Interior and the Public Health Department, arguing that French taxpayers shouldn't have to foot the bill for this man's treatment, and that it would be more appropriate for Sagawa to be sent back to Japan, where he could then be institutionalized. And sure enough, that is exactly what happened. In February of 1984, nearly 3 years after committing the crime, Sagawa Issei boarded a plane back to Japan. His only official punishment: he could never return to France. When he landed at Tokyo's Narita airport, on the other hand, Sagawa could have gone anywhere, done anything. But his father, the same man who had hired the French lawyer who got him to return to Japan, warned his son not to re-enter society right away. If he did, the media storm in Japan would be unbearable and devastating, not just for Sagawa Issei, but for his father's image and career as well. So, Sagawa Issei voluntarily admitted himself to Tokyo's Matsuzawa Psychiatric Hospital, where he stayed for 15 months. And then he simply walked out, a free man. So, why didn't the Japanese authorities try to imprison him, or even execute him, as would be more likely in Japan? Well, they did try. They really wanted this guy as far away from Japanese society as possible, but legally, there was simply nothing they could do. You see, because Sagawa had been declared unfit to be tried in France, where he had committed the crime, there was no conviction to transfer over to Japan either, even if the French authorities had wanted to do so in the first place. Additionally, under Japanese law, there was simply nothing that allowed for someone with dangerous mental health problems to be forcibly treated either. So basically, as long as he hadn't committed a crime on Japanese soil, the man was untouchable. As for Sagawa Issei's life following his return to the motherland, after checking himself out of Matsuzawa Hospital, he was more than ready to profit financially off the horrible things he had done. In fact, that process had already started while he was still in the Paris mental hospital. In 1983, Japanese author Yomota Inuhiko paid Sagawa a visit and interviewed him at length, later turning their conversation into a book titled In the Fog. The book, released against the wishes of both the Hartevelt family and Sagawa's own, became a bestseller in Japan, and for Sagawa Issei, the first proof that there was a grotesque fascination, and more importantly a market, for his story. However, the thing is, and I think this is actually a somewhat fascinating part of Sagawa Issei's story, he almost had no other option than to lean into his grotesque notoriety. Now, just to be clear, I'm not trying to defend this monster in any way, but he did try to get a normal job. It's just that no one would hire him for obvious reasons. He was instantly recognizable, and even if the people wanted to read about him, no one actually wanted him near them. And so, the only people still willing to give him any money were the media, and he would live off that attention for the rest of his life. While doing so, he went through several phases of fame. In the years directly following his crime and return to Japan, he wrote books and columns for newspapers, until public interest in his story slowly started to fade around the mid-1980s. But then, a lifeline for his fading career as the cannibal from Kobe appeared. Because in 1989, Japan was rocked by yet another disturbing murder case, this time on home soil. The serial child murders of Miyazaki Tsutomu, and for some strange reason, Japanese TV networks thought it was a great idea to bring Sagawa on as a guest, to share his thoughts on the matter. And just like that, he was back in the spotlight. Commercials, interviews, stage shows, all of them centered around his identity as the cannibal, most of them directly based on what happened in Paris on June 11th, 1981. Then, as that wave of attention started to fade as well, and as the Japanese public grew kinda tired of hearing about the crime over and over again, he simply shifted his image from killer to fetishist. He wrote for fetish magazines, appeared in several adult films, and through all of it, he was very open about the fact that his cannibalistic urges had not simply disappeared. In fact, they were as strong as ever, and Sagawa made absolutely no secret about it.
I want to eat, so I'm not cured at all.
And so, Sagawa Issei, a man declared by both the French and later by Japanese experts as both insane and dangerous and as belonging into a mental institution, roamed Japan as a free man, without supervision and an uncured appetite for human flesh. And he would do so until his death in 2022, at the age of 73. As far as we know, he never engaged in cannibalism ever again. There are so many aspects that make the story of Sagawa Issei so incredibly difficult to process. For one, and most obviously, there is what he had done to Renée Hartevelt and by extension to her family. But in causing unspeakable pain to the family of his victim, he also ruined the lives of his own loved ones in the process. His brother developed stress-related asthma. His father, despite his best efforts to contain his son's actions whenever he could, eventually was forced to resign from his job. His mother attempted to end her own life. And then there's what we, the public, did. The fact that we turned this man into a minor celebrity, allowing him to make a living from the worst thing he had ever done. Of course, I realize the sheer hypocrisy of saying this in what is a monetized YouTube video about this whole story underscored by dramatic music from a horror video game. But still, it does make you wonder, why are we so fascinated by these sorts of crimes and the people that commit them? And what are the consequences of that fascination? On that note, I will end this story by leaving you with a quote from a Japanese journalist who attended one of Sagawa's stage shows in the 1990s. What do you think about the case of Sagawa Issei? Now make sure to share your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you support me on Patreon? Then allow me to express my gratitude to each and every one of you, including Bobby Wu, Ronan, The Hockey Gentleman, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, Daniel Dees, RK0, Sierran DC, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoka the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Cats and Soup, Jarred B-Man, Ben Harradine, Metal Mama, T-Bird, and Tom Ericus Prime. And to everyone else who made it all the way through this one, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.